My name is Ben Burgis. I'm the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, which is out now from Zer0 Books. You should pick up a copy of that. What I'd like to talk about today is the election that just happened in the UK, the primaries that are coming up in the United States, and the weak analogy fallacy. There was a fairly horrible and disappointing election result in the United Kingdom. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, which, is a social democratic party, so if you're an ultra-left purist, there's no point to supporting it. But, if you're a soft and fuzzy Menshevik like me, who thinks that we have to start from social democracy if we're going to have more radical horizons later, this was a very exciting opportunity because Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is by far the most pro-worker major party in the developed world, which is, a huge advance, since after all, this is the same political party that not so long ago reformed the NHS and co-signed the invasion of Iraq. There's a tremendous danger because of the loss that it's going to backslide into, if not all the way its former Blairite self, and something that might be closer to that than I'd like. We'll have to see whether or not, now that Corbyn, in the aftermath of the defeat, is stepping down as Labour leader, whether Corbynism can survive without Corbyn at the helm. So that's all very disappointing. And of course, since I have family in the UK, there's a very real danger that Boris Johnson is going to try to privatize at least parts of the NHS as part of some sort of trade pact with the United States. We could argue about what could have been done to avert it. Certainly the fact that Labour under Corbyn's leadership did seem to be dithering on the Brexit question. All that seems to have contributed to the loss. This is all preface. I said I was going to talk about the weak analogy fallacy.
2020 candidate Joe Biden giving a new warning to the far left after Prime Minister Boris Johnson leads Conservatives to victory in the UK elections. Biden reportedly telling San Francisco fundraiser, "Look what happens when the Labour Party moves so far to the left. They come up with ideas that are not able to be contained with an irrational basis quickly." Gary, does he have a point?
Anytime you're evaluating an argument by analogy, what you want to look at are what the relevant analogies are between the two situations and the relevant disanalogies. In other words, no two situations are ever going to be exactly similar, or else there wouldn't be two situations. There'd be just one situation being compared to itself. What matters when you say such and such happened in the UK, therefore this gives us a good reason to think that something similar would happen in the US, for example, it's not good enough to reject the argument by pointing out any old difference. There are always going to be differences. That doesn't mean that argument from analogy can't be a good rational argument. But what you need to see is, okay, are the relevant analogies good enough to make this a strong argument, and are the relevant disanalogies enough to make it not a strong argument? Right? Relevant disanalogies are just the relevant respects in which the two situations are not analogous. So all kinds of people who are Bernie haters in the United States have been trying very hard and to sort of gleefully draw analogies between the British and American situations. Joe Biden was certainly all over this in, one of his more lucid moments where he was actually making some sort of an argument and not just babbling about, corn pop and, things that might or might not have happened to him in 1970. And he said, this really shows that there's a danger that if the Democratic Party goes too far to the left, that it'll lose the election to Trump, just like the Labour Party went too far to the left, and it lost an election to Boris Johnson and the Tories. First, start with the analogies. It is true, as I just said earlier, that the sort of Corbyn revolution within the Labour Party in the UK certainly swung it very far to the left compared to where it was in the sort of miserable Blairite years, or when Margaret Thatcher famously said that her greatest accomplishment was New Labour. Corbyn had a very solid left social democratic platform, doing all kinds of things that are exciting from a democratic socialist perspective. Similarly, Bernie Sanders is running on a platform that's vastly to the left, certainly of where the Democratic Party has been in recent decades, and really ever. Right? So even back when, in the sort of New Deal, Great Society heyday, when there was a certain amount of social democratic, vitamins and nutrients, mixed in with the bad stuff, what he's talking about is well to the left of the good policies of the Johnson administration, for example, and certainly way more non-interventionist in terms of foreign policy. So there's definitely an analogy there, which both Corbyn and Sanders have commented on. That part's not wrong. But let's start thinking about some relevant disanalogies. And let's also pick a little bit at the idea that we're really inferring to the best explanation of the available data when we say that Labor's loss, which actually, if you look at the votes they lost, was not as much as you might think in percentage terms for the country overall, badly geographically distributed. And again, the fact they're making losses at all as opposed to gains is very bad. But if you look at Labor's losses in 2019 and then you compare it to 2017, when they actually had their biggest gains, in fact, the biggest gains of seats and from where they were in the percentages for one political party in Great Britain since 1945 in 2017, right? They were making massive advances in 2017, and then they lost ground in 2019. Well, Jeremy Corbyn was already the leader in 2017, and his economic policies were every bit as far left in 2017 as they were in 2019. So if you think that his economic policies or his foreign policy being too far left was the explanation of the loss in 2019, then you have to cough up some evidence that left-wing economic policies became less popular between 2017 and 2019. And of course, that evidence does not exist. The premise is just not true. Those policies did not become less popular. That's nonsense. You could say that the far-left policies caused a years-long smear campaign in the British media involving total absurdities like accusing Jeremy Corbyn of being an anti-Semite. And that in turn led to a loss of popularity because the smear campaign continued for 2 years longer by 2019 than it had in 2017. And I'm sure there's some truth to that. I don't think it's that analytically useful for the left to focus on that because, of course, you always have to assume that the establishment media is going to smear you. You have to take that into account. If we're talking about what strategic mistakes were made, you can't just blame it on the other side doing what the other side is going to do. But as far as, just trying to figure out the chain of cause and effect, sure, definitely a contributing factor. But an obvious disanalogy between the British and American cases would be that the effect of the British coverage of Corbyn, which, by the way, for years was much worse than the American coverage of Sanders. Michael Brooks had a good line on the Majority Report a little while back about how, as much as we rightly complain that the American establishment media is biased against Bernie Sanders, which it absolutely is, compared to Corbyn's press coverage in Britain, Bernie's press coverage in America is like Beyonce's coverage. And you can see the effect of that. Corbyn's personal popularity numbers by 2019 were in the toilet. They were terrible long before the election, right? And in fact, even in 2017, they were very not good, right? They were making big gains because of the popularity of the platform, despite Corbyn's personal unpopularity. By comparison, again, think about the relevant disanalogies. Bernie Sanders' personal popularity numbers are vastly better, and in fact, better than Joe Biden's, I'm pretty sure.
I think one thing, though, that needs to be kept in mind when we look at Sanders on that stage tonight and his chances going forward. It's this. These are the favorable, unfavorable scores among Democratic voters for all the Democratic candidates. This is from just a couple days ago, and you can see it. Top of the list, the most popular Democratic candidate with Democratic voters, just in terms of favorable, unfavorable. It's Bernie Sanders, 75-18. That's a little bit better than Biden, Warren, Booker, Buttigieg. You go down to the bottom of the list right there.
Next, obvious relevant disanalogy. Whatever combination you want to attribute the loss to, the anti-Semitism smears, this, that, clearly a huge factor was the, let's just put this as neutrally as possible, the lack of success of Labour's strategy for navigating the Brexit referendum. I don't think anybody seriously believes the result would have been the same. That if we were looking at an alternate timeline where, just as in our timeline, Corbyn takes over the Labour Party in 2015, but in this timeline, the Brexit referendum does not pass in 2016, I don't think anybody seriously believes that things would have played out the same way since then. If you look at the election that just happened in the UK, Corbyn's strategy was to desperately try to make it not about Brexit, but it ended up being as close to single issue as elections get about Brexit, which is an issue that's particularly bad for Corbyn. Well, what's the Brexit here? Pretty sure Britain's relationship with the European Union is not going to be a major issue in the American election. On the closest equivalent of it, trade policy, then actually that's an issue where Bernie has a very clear message. It does not seem like he's triangulating, and it's a message that would play very well in the Rust Belt swing states that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. Finally, if we are interested in reading as much as Biden wants to read into the British election results as far as, possible lessons to be learned for the American election results, I've just given you a bunch of reasons to think that's a bad idea, but let's assume for the sake of argument that's a good idea. So, are you going to read what just happened in Britain as a ringing endorsement of how neoliberal centrism is globally popular? And so if only they'd had a more centrist, Blairite kind of leader in the Labour Party, somebody a bit more like Joe Biden, then Labour would have won smashingly? If so, an uncomfortable fact is that even if you say, okay, Jeremy Corbyn's the British leader who's most like Bernie Sanders, and, it was a loss for his party, fair enough. Well, who would be the British political leader who's most like Joe Biden? I think we'd have to say Joe Swinson, and the Lib Dems fared even worse. And in fact, Swinson lost, not only is not the prime minister now, which is what you would expect if the election was a great vindication of Bidenite centrism, but she didn't even hold on to her own seat. So, yeah, I think this is a pretty clear example of the weak analogy fallacy. If you want more nutritious content like this, there'll be another video from me here next Monday. Gonna try real hard as we go into the new year to maintain that regular schedule. You can also see me on Tuesday nights on the Michael Brooks Show doing the debunk. And if all that's not good enough, then you could also subscribe to my Patreon to get 2 essays a week on Tuesdays and Fridays. And if that's not good enough, then I just don't know what is good enough for you people.
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.